Hi everybody, and welcome to this video on Charles Dickens's novel Oliver Twist. I will try to keep this video as brief as possible, because I know that sitting here listening to me yap about Oliver Twist probably isn't the most exciting thing in the world, but the novel is actually really good. And I think that you're going to, if you haven't read it yet, you may want to start reading it as soon as possible. In fact, there will probably be some spoilers in here, so I want to go ahead and warn you that there might be spoilers. If you have read it, I hope this video and in conjunction with the PowerPoint presentation will help you understand the novel better. And so what I'm going to do is pause here for a minute and ask you to go into the Oliver Twist module, open that PowerPoint slideshow up, and then we can discuss the novel slide by slide. All right, so I'm back. So let's go ahead and get started. So if you open up that slideshow, the opening page, of course, says Charles Dickens' Oliver Twist, and it has a picture of Dickens himself. So I want to go ahead and go down to the next slide, slide number 2 there, and talk a little bit about Charles Dickens. When he was born isn't important. The fact that he actually had to work in a blacking factory. Blacking, by the way, was shoe polish. So he's working in a shoe polish factory. Basically, I think putting labels on bottles and tying the bottles off and other things like that. And it was hard physical labor to a certain extent, but he was there as a sentence because his father had gotten into debt and could not pay the creditor off. So the creditor threw him into something called a debtor's prison. This would affect Charles Dickens for the rest of his life. In fact, one of his favorite people at this blacking factory was a guy by the name of Fagin. And so that raises the question, well, why was one of Dickens's most despicable villains named Fagin when he had a really good friend in the blacking factory, probably the only person he liked? And there are lots of theories about that, including one that says something like Fagin still represents the darkest time of Dickens's life, even though he was a friend of his during that dark time. So there's all kinds of theories about that. But that guy named Fagin has some bearing on Oliver Twist, and also the fact that he was put to work as a child laborer to pay off his dad's debts, and it was kind of a workhouse environment, also factored into Oliver Twist. So of course he was a reporter in the court system, and then we've got during his lifetime, Charles Dickens was the most popular fiction in all of England, if not the world. He was the Stephen King, he was the J.K. Rowling of his time. If you want to think about films, he was the Steven Spielberg of his time, or the Tyler Perry of his time. Everything that Dickens wrote sold, and people loved it. And so he really was a phenomenon during his lifetime. A lot of authors you might read in literature classes might not have been as successful during their lifetimes, but we still read them today. Dickens was wildly successful. People would actually buy his books and read them to their families out loud. And Dickens did book tours where he would read his books and do the different voices for all the characters. So Fagin might sound something like this, whereas, please sir, could I have some more? It might sound something like that. So Dickens really was a phenomenon. All right, now a lot of themes that he approached, and they're not all listed on this list because it's too long a list, and some of these things on this list aren't exactly in Oliver Twist. So workers' rights, for example, is not a theme they address in Oliver Twist at all, really. He would do that in books like Bleak House and in Hard Times. England's education system, there's, Oliver never goes to school. He gets his tutoring privately when he can. So, but that is a theme that he approaches in many of his books. The rights of the people in the court systems. Remember, Oliver Twist went to court, and Fang actually judged him as guilty before even hearing any testimony. And of course, Fang let him pass out from sickness because Fang did not believe that he was really sick. But the court systems, particularly like the Chancery Court system and Bleak House, is something that Dickens will attack. Saving orphans, and of course that's where Oliver Twist comes in, and then of course saving women from prostitution. This is, again, not really a big deal in Oliver Twist because most of the women in that book are actually thieves, or pickpockets or things like that. But prostitution is touched on a little bit, particularly when Claypole suggests to Oliver, when he says she was a bad one, that, he's accusing her of being a prostitute. Of course, we will learn later that that's not even close to the truth, but that's why Oliver basically gives him a behind the woodshed type beating right there in the room. And of course, many of the themes that Dickens wrote about in the mid-1800s are still relevant in the world today. So we're going to talk a little bit about that as we go through the themes portion of this slideshow. So the next one, the Poor Law of 1834. This is the main thing that Charles Dickens is attacking as he's writing Oliver Twist. Because the book was actually written from 1837 to 1839. So the Poor Law of 1834 would have been in full effect at the time that this book was written. Basically what had happened was taxes were taking care of poor people, kind of like in the United States. In fact, you're going to see some similarities between England of 1834 and the United States of the 21st century as we talk about some of this. But basically, the upper and middle classes were paying these taxes, and some of that tax money was going to help support poor people through food subsidies or through rent subsidies or whatever. And of course, the rich people suspected that their tax money was going to waste, that it was going to people who did not want to work, that their tax money was going to lazy people and people who were able-bodied and could work if they just get out and find a job, but they weren't doing so. So their tax, so basically the rich people were saying, we're working so hard to pay for the poor man to live a life of comfort. Does that sound familiar in the 21st century? I think you've heard this before on news programs and editorials, and probably even from your parents, for all I know. So one thing you're going to learn as you read literature is that a lot of the stuff that we discuss in the 21st century was being discussed as far back as whenever the book you're reading was discussed. And this whole my taxes are paying for welfare queens discussion was going on at least in the 1830s. So that's nothing new. All right, so the Poor Law was passed in 1834. Basically, the main, there were several components of it, but the main component was that workhouses were being built. And what a workhouse was the Poor Law said, our taxes now will not go directly to the poor. Our taxes now will be going to some government officials or some church officials, and they will actually open up these poorhouses where people will have to go in and work hard just to earn a little bit of food, a bed, and a little bit of clothing. Now, on purpose, the purpose of this law was to make these workhouses so awful and so the living conditions so abhorrent that people would actually go out and find a low-wage job rather than live off the government's handouts. So these houses were actually designed to be horror houses. The problem with that is that not everybody can find jobs. So, the horrifying conditions that I'm talking about on this slide was hard work, monotonous physical labor. The families are split up. So if a family, a man, a wife, and his children went into a poorhouse, the husband and wife are separated and weren't allowed to see each other, and the children were separated by gender, not allowed to see each other. So families were split up as a way to try and encourage people not to go into the poorhouse, but rather to go out and find a job somewhere. The workers were severely underfed, and I've given you a specific example on this slideshow of the Andover workhouse. The workers were so underfed that they were working in the Andover workhouse to kind of grind up bones of animals to make fertilizer. And these people were so underfed, they were eating the dust from the bones, or they were eating some of the rotten meat off of the bones in order to get a taste of meat. They were so underfed that they were eating the fertilizer, essentially. Now, if you've opened a bag of fertilizer lately, you know that can't really taste or smell very good. So the Andover workhouse is probably the most severe of the malnutrition, but people were dying of starvation in these houses. And they were seriously, looking like walking pretzel sticks because they were so malnourished. And of course, again, the workhouses were run by people appointed by the government. All right, next slide. The workers within the workhouses did not get a salary. All they got was their little bit of food, which a lot of times was gruel, which is what Oliver Twist gets in the beginning of the story, which is essentially watered down oatmeal. And by watered down oatmeal, I mean it looks like water. there's not really a lot of oatmeal in the watered down oatmeal. And then, of course, they got a bed to sleep in and then clothes. But the clothes were generally rags. They weren't nice clothes. They were sometimes hand-me-downs and threadbare and wouldn't really keep you all that warm in the winter or anything like that. All right. So I talked about the conditions already. And then there was the no outdoor portion of the poor law. Now, this part of the poor law was eventually, at some point, relaxed a little bit. But what the no outdoor portion of the law says is these workhouses were not allowed to accept charity handouts from anybody else. They were only funded by the government. They were not, or by the church, which essentially in England was the same thing because the Church of England is a government entity. So nobody could contribute money to a poorhouse to try to help them out. The poorhouses, if they were starving their people, they starved their people. That was the end of it. All right. Of course, there were many objections to the poor law, and these objections started almost immediately. The poor law was passed in 1834. I don't remember the exact date, and maybe 2 days later, people were already screaming out, crying foul, if you will. One was it imprisoned the very poor people that it was supposed to help for no reason other than the fact they were poor. So basically, they were saying, "Hey, you're sentencing these people to live in a poorhouse, not go outside, not go out and have any fun, and they have to eat basically jailhouse food." And they can't see their families, and they toil away at hard labor all day. And you're penalizing them, and the only thing they're guilty of is being poor. A lot of times through no fault of their own. So that was one of the objections to the poor law. Of course, the living and working conditions are inhumane. I talked about Andover already, but Andover may have been a super exceptional case, but there are plenty of other examples of inhumane working conditions. I talked about the families being split apart. And corrupt officials would skim money that was supposed to go to the poor off the top. So this happens in Oliver Twist. This happens with, we'll talk about her in a minute, the lady that runs that little baby farm. She was getting money from the officials, taking a large cut of it, basically giving the kids food with what was left, and kids were starving to death. Malnourishment was a big problem. And basically, she was buying herself a little bit of gin and some nicer food, and so on and so forth. So that was not an uncommon practice for an official that ran a workhouse to, I'll take a little bit for myself here. Okay, I'll take a little bit more, and I'll give them these scraps that are left. All right, so workhouse in Oliver Twist. He's born into a workhouse. His unmarried mother walks into one that's pregnant. They do allow her to give birth in that workhouse, and then, of course, she dies. So Oliver is then sent off to one of those baby farms, and that's Mrs. Mann. That's who I was talking about 30 seconds ago. So Mrs. Mann has a baby farm where basically all the babies are brought to her, and she feeds them as little as she can get away with, starves a few of them to death, and then keeps the rest. And then at 9 years old, Oliver is determined by the board, and we'll see the board, to be too old to be at a baby farm anymore. So then he's put into the workhouse to pick oakum, which is essentially hemp. Hemp is, of course, what marijuana is made out of, but mainly hemp was used to make shipping supplies, and in particular rope. So, but hemp had several uses, and so he would have to pick that. And then, of course, after he rebels a little bit, we'll talk about that later, he gets sent out of the workhouse to do an apprenticeship with a casket builder by the name of Sowerberry. All right, so that poor law was really the main target of Dickens's wrath in Oliver Twist. Now, the novel itself, it was his second book. He had already published the Pickwick Papers, or he was actually in the act of publishing the Pickwick Papers when he was started publishing Oliver Twist. And the way that works is through something called serial publication, which is the next little bullet point there. So from April 1837 to April 1839, with one exception, and that was a time when I think Dickens's sister or mother died, or somebody important to him died. Every month he would put out the next 3 or 4 chapters, or the next 2 or 3 chapters, and then people get excited, and of course the next month he'd put out the next 2 or 3 chapters, and this was in a serial publication like a magazine every single month. Now remember, there was no such thing as television back in the 1830s. So this was how people got their entertainment. And today's television programs, say like name your favorite television program, whatever it is. You know how they end with a cliffhanger at the very end, like a big reveal in many cases, or in Game of Thrones, like a big death or something. It's like, oh my gosh, I can't wait to tune in next week to see what happens. That came from serial publication. That's how people sold magazines. They would have these cliffhangers at the end of chapter 3 or the end of chapter 10 or the end of chapter whatever, so that people would come back the next month and buy the next issue. And Charles Dickens was a master of this. So it took him, as you can see, a little over 2 years to get Oliver Twist completely out. So that's why I say he had already published all but the final 10 chapters or so of Pickwick Papers when he started Oliver Twist. So for a couple, 2 or 3 months there, he was publishing both simultaneously. And then his third book, and I can't remember what the name of it is right off the top of my head, but he started publishing that with about 10 chapters or so left of Oliver Twist. All right. Oliver Twist was so popular it cemented his status as a popular author. Just like with Steven Spielberg, Jaws cemented his status as a great director. Or in the case of Stephen King, Carrie. Once Carrie was published, all of a sudden, bam, he was popular, and he remained that way throughout the rest of his life. Same thing with Charles Dickens. Oliver Twist made him a celebrity, and boom, he was a celebrity the rest of his life. And then, of course, there have been many, many film adaptations of Oliver Twist. The most recent, they date all the way back to the silent era, and the most recent significant one was in 2005, and it was directed by Roman Polanski. There have also been television versions, like the BBC has had, a multi-part series on that, and so on and so forth. And then, of course, there was the play Oliver, which was released in 1968. It was performed in London and on Broadway, and has been performed in many playhouses ever since. So Oliver Twist's popularity has endured throughout all these years. All right. So now that we've talked about all of that, if you want to take a break, hit the pause button. Maybe go get yourself a glass of water or something. In fact, I'm going to have myself some water. All right. Come back and we'll continue on from there. All right. Let's talk about the main characters. Oliver Twist, obviously, the title character is the main character. He is orphaned at birth. He's probably an hour or two old, but his mom finally gives him that little kiss and passes out and dies. As he goes through his life's journey, his goodness and purity will save him, even in the face of great temptation. We're going to talk about that a good bit when we get to the themes. Fagin, a Jewish crime boss who leads a gang of boy thieves. He basically has the boys bring him his stuff. He gives them maybe a small cut, and then he keeps most of it except for what he gives to Skiles. A lot of people were offended by the fact that Fagin was Jewish. Jews were not very common in 1837 in England. England has its own church, the Church of England, and they pretty much were at odds. They probably weren't really at battle with the Catholic Church anymore in 1837. A lot of that was like during the years from King Henry VIII on up. But Jews were not very well liked in England at the time. Benjamin Disraeli had not been elected prime minister yet. That wouldn't happen until much later, like the 1880s, I think. So Jews had a bad rap as being money grubbers. There was a law that said that you could not loan money to anybody for interest unless you were a Jew. So a lot of Jews would charge enormous interest rates, and of course that hurt their popularity. So Fagin, being a Jew, is actually considered to be an anti-Semitic statement by Charles Dickens. There's no evidence to back that up, but it's a discussion people have. But the most important thing about Fagin is he's evil, and, well, mostly evil. He actually cares about the boys. So I won't say he's completely evil. But he does, because he does care about the boys. But he does train them how to be thieves and pickpockets, and then he runs that little ring. John Dawkins, a.k.a. the Artful Dodger, he's a very charismatic young pickpocket. He's the one that discovers Oliver when he gets outside the city limits of London, brings him to Fagin, and he's supposed to be the one to teach Oliver how to be such a great pickpocket because the Artful Dodger is good at it. In fact, it takes the authorities a long time to catch him. Charlie Bates is also another one of Fagin's most trusted thieves. Skiles, a brutal thief and housebreaker. He's also a murderer. He has some sort of authority over Fagin. I don't know that it's clear what that authority is. I know that Fagin's supposed to give him a cut of whatever the boys steal, but I'm not sure why Skiles is the crime lord and Fagin is just basically taking care of the boys. Nancy is one of Fagin's thieves. There is some suggestion that she is Skiles' girlfriend, and really she's a live-in girlfriend. But Nancy's important because she realizes, hey, there's good in Oliver. Maybe Oliver can be redeemed in a way that she does not feel like she herself can be redeemed. Rose and Brownlow try to redeem her and try to save her on numerous occasions, and she's like, nope, I can't do it. I'm too loyal to Skiles, and I'm too loyal to Fagin, so I can't be saved. But Oliver can be saved, and she's willing to help with that. Mr. Brownlow, a wealthy older gentleman who takes an interest in Oliver's best interests. This happens, of course, after the Artful Dodger and Bates actually steal his handkerchief, and there's a chase on for Oliver. Once Brownlow realizes Oliver was not the thief, especially after the trial, he decides to take Oliver in. And we don't know exactly why he chose Oliver at first, but eventually it does become clear because Mr. Brownlow has his suspicions. Mr. Grimwig is the best friend of the Brownlows. Mr. Grimwig, of course, the "I'll eat my head" guy, if you'll remember him. He is actually the anti-Brownlow at first. He does not believe in the goodness of Oliver Twist. He believes that Oliver is innately evil because Oliver is hanging out with a bunch of thieves, and he's a street kid, and he's a poor kid, so there can't be any good in him. And it takes Grimwig a long time before he eats his head. Of course, not literally, but before he actually comes around to Brownlow's way of thinking. Lowspurn is the doctor, friend of the Maley family. Lowspurn is the one that treats Oliver after his gunshot wound, and he takes a special interest in Oliver as well. Mrs. Maley is a very wealthy lady. Remember, it was her house that Skiles takes Oliver up to rob, and then, of course, all the chaos ensues. And ironically, after being shot, Oliver ends up back at her house, and she takes him in because she thinks he's such a good boy. Rose Maley is her. It's unclear. She's adopted. She's a niece. She's not really a blood relative, but yet Mrs. Maley treats her like one, like a daughter. So I put down Mrs. Maley's adopted daughter. Sometimes she says adopted niece, but basically Rose has a checkered past, and Mrs. Maley raises her as her own child. And really, it's not Rose that has a checkered past; it's Rose's family. Harry Maley, the biological son of Mrs. Maley, madly in love with Rose, wants to marry her. Rose doesn't think she's worthy of him, and he has to convince her otherwise. Mr. Bumble, such a fitting name for this character. He is the parish beadle. The beadle is essentially a private police officer employed by the Church of England to watch over a parish, and it is up to Mr. Bumble to enforce the poor laws, such as making sure that the boys stay in the workhouse, making sure that the boys don't question authority, and so on and so forth. Mrs. Corney, later Mrs. Bumble, is a matron to a workhouse. Eventually, Mr. Bumble decides that he wants to run a workhouse himself instead of being the beadle anymore, so he marries Mrs. Corney, or convinces her to marry him, and it turns out she's the wiser of the two, even though she's not really all that bright herself. Mr. Sowerberry is a parochial undertaker. What that means is when the boys die under Nan's care, or the boys die in the workhouse care, or anybody dies while a member of the workhouse and doesn't have enough money to pay for a funeral, the state pays Sowerberry to build a casket and perform the burial. And remember, Oliver also has to be what's called a mute, which essentially means he marches along with the funeral party if the person is so poor they don't have a funeral party because they don't know anybody. Noah Claypole is another apprentice under Sowerberry. He would later join Fagin's gang. Noah Claypole is the reason why Oliver gets in trouble while with Mr. Sowerberry, and eventually decides it's time to leave Sowerberry and get away from Noah. Old Sally, a workhouse employee, holds a very important secret concerning Oliver. If you haven't read the book yet, it will be revealed what that secret is. If you've read the book, then you know what it is. So those are the main characters. Now, this book also has probably 20 or 30 other characters. Many of them make brief appearances. Some of them probably deserve more credit than I have given them by leaving them off the list. But I didn't want to go through every single character. I just wanted to hit the highlights and name the ones I thought were most important. Alright, so there are 5 themes in Oliver Twist. These are the 5 topics I chose for your paper. Coming of age, crime and criminals, institutional cruelty, city versus country, and family, or some variation of it. So let's go ahead and get started with the first one, which is the coming-of-age story, also known as a Bildungsroman. A Bildungsroman is essentially a coming-of-age story. Usually it focuses on a single protagonist, usually a very young one, such as Oliver Twist. Basically, these people go through these painful experiences where they end up gaining wisdom and growing into adulthood through very painful processes. So many times these Bildungsromans will clash against the social order. Remember that Oliver Twist says, "Please, sir, I want some more," and everybody's horrified. How dare this boy ask for more? The maturation process is usually a long, slow one. Oliver Twist takes place over the course of at least a couple years. Many times a Bildungsroman will involve a long literal journey, and Oliver goes through that. Right when he leaves Sowerberry, he ends up going on a very long journey to London, which takes him 7 days, and he's darn near dying of starvation before the Artful Dodger sees him. In addition to Oliver Twist, Charles Dickens wrote 2 other novels that are considered 2 of the greatest Bildungsromans ever written. David Copperfield, which is a super long book, which is why I did not have you read that one, and Great Expectations, which I could have had you read, but in the state of Georgia, many times kids read Great Expectations in high school, so I decided to not make you read it a second time. So those are 2 more of the great Bildungsromans written by Charles Dickens. Other Bildungsromans might include Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. It's a female Bildungsroman, but it's still a coming-of-age process for her. Some of the more modern ones might include, some people have called Harry Potter a Bildungsroman, because you start off with Harry Potter as a very, very young boy living with the Dursleys, and then he gets swept up into this world of wizarding at Hogwarts, and he comes of age right before our eyes up until what would have been his senior year at Hogwarts, had he not, of course, dropped out. And Catcher in the Rye is a coming-of-age story. To Kill a Mockingbird is a coming-of-age story. Any of these are known as great Bildungsromans. And Oliver Twist has a Bildungsroman element built into it. All right. So Oliver, of course, is orphaned before he's even 1 hour old. He is his mom barely has time to look at him, plant a kiss on his forehead, bam, she's out. Nobody knows who his father is. Oliver will stand up against the social order when he tells the master, "Please, sir, I want some more." And of course, the board believes that Oliver is fated for the gallows, particularly the guy in the white coat. So, the fact that he would dare challenge the social order by asking for more food when he and his fellows are being starved to death causes a lot of chaos at the workhouse. After Oliver leaves Sowerberries, he literally goes on a 7-day journey to London. And it's not an easy journey, it's a very difficult one. And then, of course, he must rely on his good human nature to see him through tough situations, even in the face of great peer pressure from Fagin and the gang. It would be very easy to give in to Fagin, it would be very easy to give in to the Artful Dodger, but he stands strong. He does suffer both physical and emotional pain, and there are several examples of both. I just chose one of each. So the physical, he gets shot in the arm. He goes into a stranger's house, and as he's trying to run out, he gets shot. That's a physical pain. I've never actually been pierced by a bullet, but I've been told that it hurts like hell. So you got that physical pain there, among many others. And then the emotional. So, for example, the torment he feels when he feels like he's let Mr. Brownlow down. It agonizes him that he feels like he's let Mr. Brownlow down. And then, of course, once Oliver has proven himself worthy, he becomes incorporated to the lives of Mr. Brownlow and into the Maylie family. So after going through all these trials and tribulations and becoming much wiser and becoming a little bit battle-scarred, if you will, he does eventually get accepted into the social order, and as it turns out, the one that he's supposed to be accepted into. All right, now we're going on to the next theme. Again, at any time, if this feels a little redundant to you or it feels like it's dragging on, take the time to hit the pause button and go to the restroom or grab another drink of water or whatever you feel like you have to do. But I'm going to go ahead and soldier forward. So, crime and criminals in Oliver Twist. There are some literal criminals. In fact, this book is full of them. If you look at a list of every character in Oliver Twist, more than 50% of them are going to be criminals of some sort. So you got Fagin, who's the ringleader of the boys. You got Skiles, who's a housebreaker and a murderer, as it turns out. The Artful Dodger is probably Fagin's star student as a pickpocket. And then Monks. Monks will stoop to any level to hide Oliver's true identity. In fact, Monks is not even Monks' real name, we're going to find out. So he will suppress any evidence of Oliver's birthright because Monks wants to keep all that money for himself. And he steals from his own mother, and he's really a very obnoxious character. Then you got the social criminals. Mrs. Corney, the matron of the workhouse, she steals the evidence that old Sally gives her because she doesn't want that evidence getting out. And oh, by the way, that evidence happens to be gold, and it's jewelry. So she's going to steal it rather than give it to the authorities. Mrs. Mann steals money from the government. Going back to Mrs. Corney, old Sally could be considered a thief as well because, the young lady, which turns out to be Oliver's mother, entrusts her with that necklace and entrusts her with that ring. And as it turns out, old Sally sticks it in the pawn shop so she can have some money. So she's a bit of a social criminal. Mrs. Mann steals money from the government given to her for the care of the children in her baby farm. So basically, the government gives her, and there's no numbers in the book, but let's assume the government gives her $1,000 or £1,000 a month to take care of the children, which would have been way more than they would have actually given her back in 1830 something. But let's say they give her £1,000, she skims 500 of off the top, and then she uses the other 500 to take care of her kids, and that 500 barely gets her by, whereas 1,000 would have probably been fine. And then Mr. Bumble, he's not literally a criminal, but he sure is inept as a law enforcement officer, and he loves his power. He loves being a distinguished beetle. Charles Dickens, by the way, did not like beetles. He thought they were probably the most useless form of law enforcement in all of England. So any chance he got to make beetles look really bad in his books, he did. And of course, Bumble is a really good example of a very inept beetle. All right. Many readers actually feel uncomfortable with the large number of criminals in Oliver Twist. If I had made you get the Norton anthology version of this, you would see numerous examples of critics who said, don't buy this book, there are too many criminals in it. Don't buy this book, there are too many unsavory characters in it. It shows too much of the dark side of humanity. So a lot of people have been uncomfortable with that, and some modern day critics agree with that. Criminals and their hideouts reveal the dark side of humanity, and of course Oliver Twist is thrust right in the middle of that in Fagin's den, and by being forced to go on jobs with Skiles. And then if Oliver can overcome the criminal element in his life, then he'll be able to overcome anything. So this is a major test for him. Will he be able to overcome this criminal element? If he can, he's going to be just fine. If not, he will suffer the same fate of people like, say, the Artful Dodger and many others. All right. Next slide is about institutional cruelty. This is institutions that are set up to help people that actually do more harm than good. And in many cases, it's actually on purpose. So, people that run the workhouses are stealing from the very people they're supposed to be helping. And again, we can look at Mrs. Mann as a prime example of that. Children suffering from serious malnutrition, and many adults are as well. And of course, a lot of them are dying from starving. So they go into these workhouses to get food, and they're not getting enough food to sustain their lives, and they end up dying. Mr. Fang, the magistrate, has already determined that Oliver is guilty of stealing from Mr. Brownlow, and he hasn't even heard any evidence yet. In fact, he's actually very mean to Oliver. And when Oliver says he doesn't feel so well, Fang's like, yeah, you're just faking, kid. And it takes Oliver passing out in order for Fang to at least acknowledge that part. And then Mr. Bumble is a church official, but he's not a very Christian guy. He drinks the gin. He encourages abusive children. Like, for example, when Sourberry whips off Oliver, Bumble wants that to happen. So he's very unchristian in many ways, and that is part of the issue. All right. Next, we got the city versus the country in Oliver Twist, and I gave you a little bullet point list here. So the city is a den of thieves. Lots of criminals live in the city. Whereas in the country, you've got good-hearted, benevolent people like Brownlow and like the Maley family. So you go from the thieves to the morally superior. Dark settings in the city, such as in Fagin's Den, such as in the bar scene, such as all over the place. Whereas in the country, there are bright, sunny settings. Fresh air, birds chirping. You have it. All right. The city is a place of sickness. Oliver gets his soul sickened as well as his body sickened in some ways. Whereas the country is a place of healing. Every time Oliver goes out into the country, he starts to feel better. His health improves. He's getting better nutrition. He's getting care and love from his benefactors. And so the country is a place of healing, whereas the city, people get sick. All right, the city's dirty. The country is very, very clean. It's outdoorsy. In fact, Charles Dickens actually exaggerates how clean the country is in his books. So city, setting for sin, whereas country is a setting for goodness. I think we've talked about that a little bit. In the city, everybody's broken, poor, and living in poverty. People go to the city to seek their fortunes, only to end up in workhouses or to end up in crime rings and so on and so forth. Whereas in the country, both Brownlow himself and the Maley family are very, very wealthy. And as it turns out, since Oliver was born in a bit of a rural town, his mother came from a very wealthy family as well. And that's a nice segue to the next slide, which is about family. All right. So in order to have true identity, someone must have a family. Oliver has no family, therefore he does not feel a sense of identity. He does not feel a sense of belonging to anybody. In fact, Oliver is so orphaned that he doesn't even have a name when he was born. Bumble names him Oliver Twist. And he gives his reasons, which are he's naming the kids in alphabetical order, and he got to the letter T when he got to Twist. Oliver Twist sounds great to him. So, Oliver Twist does not even know his real family name. He just knows what the Beatle named him. All right, family determines one's social status. You're born into money, you're rich. You're born into poverty, you're poor. End of story. There's not a lot of social movement in this book, except for with Rose and Oliver. They both are upwardly mobile. And of course, Monks is actually downwardly mobile. He starts off pretty wealthy, but he ends up turning to a life of crime. All right. Fagin's Den of Thieves has a very strange family-like dynamic to it. You know, Fagin calls the boys my dear, and the girls too, for that matter. They feel a sense of community in there because they belong to something. It's a gang of thieves or it's a gang of pickpockets, but these kids belong to something. And the Artful Dodger is kind of their hero. So, because of that, Fagin's Den acts as a bit of a surrogate family to boys who otherwise wouldn't have a family at all. And Nancy is the best example of this. She will not turn Fagin and Skiles in. In fact, she wants to protect Fagin and Skiles from any kind of capture or prosecution, but she does want to help Oliver out, and so she takes a liking to Oliver. So she does want to help him out by getting rid of Oliver's half-brother there. But she's going to remain faithful to the men who are criminals. And it ends up costing her her life. She ends up getting murdered by Skiles. Alright. Continuing on with the family theme, Rose feels unworthy to marry Harry because of her family's checkered past. She doesn't fully understand her family's checkered past. She knows that there's something going on there. And when Harry, who's madly in love with her, wants to marry her, she says, "Oh, I'm not worthy of you, Harry. Please go achieve your dreams and marry a woman who's more worthy than I am." All right. Oliver's mother's family casts her out of the family and changes his last name and moves from England to Wales because of her premarital pregnancy. This was not an uncommon occurrence. If a family had a daughter and she got pregnant before she got married, it would be scandalous. The family would be ruined. And it's not unusual in the 1800s, during the Victorian times, if a daughter were to walk in with a bun in the oven, to be thrown out of the family and cast out into the cold streets to, in many cases, turn to a life of prostitution because there were not a lot of job opportunities for women then. I can't imagine a lot that goes on in the 21st century. You know, if a family's 16-year-old daughter shows up pregnant now and not married, yes, the family's disappointed. Yes, there's probably some crying. There's probably some screaming. There might even be some name calling. But usually the girl is not thrown out into the streets, and usually the family name is not scarred all that much because other families have teenage daughters getting pregnant. But in this case, the Fleming family changes its name and moves to another country because Wales was not really a part of Great Britain at the time. They changed their name and moved to another country because they are so scandalized by the fact that their little girl got impregnated by a man that she loved very much and he loved her very much. So there's that family issue. And in the end of the book, Oliver finally finds contentment when he actually has a family. He has blood relatives, and it's revealed that Rose is an aunt, and he now has been adopted by Brownlow. So once he has a sense of family, it's a life of happily ever after that. So that's it. That's Oliver Twist. I said I was going to try to keep this video brief, and I promise you this is probably about as brief as I could get it. But I hope that it helps you have a better understanding of Oliver Twist and will help you as you write your papers on whichever topic it is you choose to write about for this book.